All right, my name's David Heatherington, and in 1985 we set up a small museum attached to High House Chapel. You can see the museum in the foreground there and High House Chapel behind it. In 2018, I stepped down from being the curator of the Weardale Museum in order to take on a new role to create a flagship attraction for the Weardale Museum, which was going to be called the Methodist Tapestries Collection. What I hope that you'll get out of this talk today, I'll tell you what the Methodist Tapestry Collection is, how and why the project came about, who's involved in the project, how they're styled, what they look like, how we went about choosing the stories to go in the collection, where they can be seen and where they'll eventually be housed. And when I'm doing this, I hope that I'm going to show you some of the completed tapestries that have been done, so that you can focus on the quality of the works and the range of some of the stories that we tell. So the Methodist Tapestries Collection is a collection of embroideries which have been framed behind glass. They're about the size of a chair back, and they all tell stories of the people called Methodists. Our project started in 2018, and it's taken quite a long time in order to get the project finished. It's not finished yet. It'll probably finish by the end of this year. I've already created over 90 of the designs. 40 something are still with stitches being completed. But at the moment we have 35 framed embroideries, like the ones you can see on the chairs, and a further 12 which are mounted but still to be framed behind glass. This is High House Chapel. The left picture you can see is in our countryside setting. High House is a very old Methodist chapel. It's our society dates from 1748, when evangelists came from out of the area to bring Methodism into the lead mining population of Weardale. By 1752, John Wesley had been. By 1760, the small group had grown large enough in order to need a building to worship in, and they built a chapel, which later became called High House. Wesley visited 12 further times during his lifetime, coming in the last year of his life. It was a popular destination for him. And the society at High House grew and grew throughout the 19th century until it finally closed just a few years ago. On the right-hand side, you can see the interior of High House Chapel. This is what it looked like after some Victorian alterations and enlargements. Now, as the curator of the little museum, which is attached to High House Chapel there on the left-hand side of the building, I used to come regularly with visitors into the chapel to tell them about the history of Methodism at High House and Wesley's visits. And often we had coach parties who came to the museum, and because we're such a tiny building, we needed to divide the coach parties into two, so that half of them spent the time in the museum and half in the chapel, and then they swapped over. So I needed to find enough to talk about in the chapel that would last half an hour or 45 minutes. And I got to do a lot of research on Methodism during that time, learned a lot of stories, had to answer a lot of questions. So although I'm not a Methodist historian, I do have quite a wide knowledge of Methodism. Unfortunately, in 2016, dry rot was discovered in the chapel building. And by the time the circuit and the district got round to examining it and looking at it, it had spread considerably. They'd had surveyors in, they found other problems, and decided that worship would cease in High House Chapel in 2019. Now, the museum trustees, separate from the chapel trustees, we rented the museum from the chapel. The two properties were owned by the Methodists, and we were told we were going to have to find new property. In the end, actually, the Methodist circuit and district found that they couldn't evict us because we had a lease which ran up to 2028. So instead, they offered us the chapel building, which the museum trustees decided that they would take up. So we bought them the chapel building with the intention of doing all of the repairs and renovating it and making it into an extended heritage building where we could continue to tell the story of John Wesley and the Methodists, along with other things. We were working on a business plan one night and discussing how we would manage to attract enough people to our new venture in order to make it sustainable. And the trustees were coming up with ideas about events and exhibitions, etc., that they could hold. And as curator, I said, what we really need is a flagship feature, something which will go into the chapel, which is going to attract people because it's worth coming to see. Something like the crown jewels. Well, we didn't have the crown jewels, but I'd been to see something in Carlisle a few months before, something called the Scottish Diaspora Tapestry, which was 350 tapestries of the Scottish people from around the world. And I thought, there's also the Quaker tapestry in Kendal, which is quite popular. And so I suggested to my trustees that perhaps we could create a Methodist tapestry. I didn't think that there was one. And if we could create something of a large enough scale and a good enough quality, it could be a feature which would attract not only Methodists to the building, but also a wide range of people who were interested in good quality embroidery. And so that's how really and why the project started. It was in order to get a sustainable audience into our new venture. And also, of course, to to help to preserve the Methodist heritage of the building too. We were going to restore the building and make alterations to it. And one of the things we were going to do was to create on the upper floor of the building a flat surface rather than tiered pews. So this was the intention, that that area would be telling the story of Methodism and our own history of Methodism within High House. Who was involved? Well, as the person who suggested it, I was going to be the creator. I was really given the job of making it happen. In order to save money so that we didn't have to pay an artist, I would also be the artist. And with my knowledge of Methodism, I would also be the storyteller. Alan, who was the project leader for the changes that were going to happen in High House Chapel, he helped me to to fundraise to start off the Tapestries project. And so the first thing that Alan did was to he found the details for the Durham Embroidery Guild, and together we went down to see the Durham Embroidery Guild with some drawings to see whether this would be something that they were interested in. Let me show you the drawings that I went down with to start with. I should have done this earlier. When I was talking to the trustees at the business meeting, I didn't have anything to show them. Can you still hear me? Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can, David.
Oh, good. I got a quirk there. When I was talking, I say the business plan meeting, I didn't have anything to show our trustees. So I went away, and the next business meeting that we had, I took to them a drawing that I'd made of John Wesley arriving in Weardale. And I said, this is what I'm thinking about, embroideries that look something like this. The trustees took some convincing, and they weren't convinced by my single drawing. So I went away, and 2 months later, I came back with 15 drawings of the history of High House Chapel. And I said, this is what I'm thinking about at a bigger scale, 15 drawings to tell the history of High House Chapel. But just think, if I go on to tell the story of Methodism, how many stories I can find for that as well. So going back. So I took those 15 drawings down to the Durham Embroidery Guild. They were very interested in doing it, or in being involved in doing it. And so then Alan he raised some money in order that we could get a coordinator for the project. And Liz became our coordinator. And she's the person who's involved. She coordinates me and Alan and Tracy, who's our advisor, and all of the embroiderers that we've got. And she knits the whole thing together, and she keeps in touch with everybody while I'm doing the drawing. So we had Liz. Liz created a Facebook page. We put the idea out on Facebook, and we started getting interest from people who wanted to take part in the project. We asked the Durham Embroidery Guild if they could provide us with an advisor, because Alan and myself, being mere men, knew nothing about embroidery whatsoever. And the Durham Embroidery Guild said, well, we don't have anybody here that can advise you. Why don't you ask Tracy Franklin? I'd never heard of Tracy Franklin, but Tracy Franklin is one of the leading embroiderers in the country. She's the chief broiderer at Durham Cathedral. She's a Royal School of Needlework embroiderer. She's one of the people who was involved in embroidering the gown for Queen Camilla at the coronation. So she really knows her stuff. And she teaches in Durham and has a workshop there. We went to see her, she came to see us, and we explained our project to her, and she said she would be delighted to be our advisor. And so that was an absolute marvelous find for us at the time. We knew that we wanted our works to be preserved and framed, and we were lucky enough to have John, our framer, who lived not 400 yards from us. So we asked him if he wanted to be involved, and he said yes as well. We just needed embroiderers now. Well, we thought that we might get lots and lots of embroiderers from the Methodist community. But our first port of call had been to the Durham Embroidery Guild. And they set away, or some of their members set away, embroidering some of those 15 designs that I'd done. And what we found was that when the first few designs came in from our embroiderers from the guild, it rather put off ordinary people with ordinary skills. And so most of our embroiderers have come from the embroidery world rather than the Methodist world. We do have quite a lot of Methodist embroiderers in our 75, but not as many as we had thought of originally. We thought that most of our embroiderers would be Methodists, whereas most of our embroiderers are in fact embroiderers. And we have 75 of them. When we were discussing with Tracy and the Embroidery Guild and with Liz what we wanted the tapestries to look like, we decided on a house style. They would all be in a frame which was square. They would be mounted, they would be behind glass. The story, which I would draw onto the fabric, would go into the circle in the middle, and we'd put some frills on the outside. And around the circle would go a title for the story. I knew from looking at lots and lots of embroideries at Carlisle when I went to see the Scottish diaspora that you don't want too much reading. So we decided that each of the stories would have a title around the outside, which would give it a small idea of what it was about. And then to go with each of the embroideries, there would be a text of no more than 150 words. And you can see the little text frame underneath there. So that was going to be our house style. What we didn't want to happen was that all of the embroideries would look the same. My sister-in-law is an embroiderer, City and Guilds embroiderer, and I knew from the works that I'd seen in her home of the fantastic range of skills that she had, and I wanted something of that to come out in our project. So we decided that it would be freestyle embroidery, which really means give the drawing to the embroiderer and let them get on with it and do what they want. The only thing we said was it's going to be behind glass, so you can't do anything that's too 3D. It's got to fit behind the glass. And so there we've got 4 of the different stitching styles, another 4 of the different stitching styles. Apparently the Royal School of Needlework has over 450 stitching styles, so there's plenty to go on there. But one of the reasons we wanted it to be freestyle was that we knew that it would interest the embroiderers much more if they could express their full range of skills, and we would get something that was really worthwhile to look at. Whereas if the embroidery was only working to one stitch, we wouldn't get the number of volunteers that we needed, and the embroiderers themselves wouldn't be as interested in their work as if they could do their own styles. Another reason we wanted it to be freestyle embroidery was for the people who were coming to look at them. I found that when I was looking at the Scottish diaspora tapestry, of which there were 350 panels, that when I'd actually seen 20 or 30 panels, there was nothing new to look at in the stitching because they were all stitched to the same stitch, if you understand what I mean. That was their style. And so after about 30, I'd lost interest in the stitching, and my whole interest had to be in the stories, which was quite difficult with 350 of them. So we wanted to make sure that all of our tapestries were different, and people who would come to see them would spend extra time looking at the tapestries because each one was different from the last one that they looked at. And because we were going to have 100 tapestries, I thought they'll want to come back because they haven't seen them properly. So that was a good marketing ploy, really. How did we come to choose our stories? Well, We wanted to tell the story of our own chapel, and we had 15 stories to tell. We wanted school children to design some panels, and we also wanted to tell the wider stories of the people called Methodists. So we wanted a wide range of stories altogether, some of them, though, telling our own story. These were the stories which we were going to tell, and that's my original designs for them. Now, our story, going back right to John Wesley's early visits through to 2018, when the chapel closed, gives a good idea of what was happening in many chapels of that time. So we start with the evangelists who brought the message into Weardale, then the building of the chapel, the visits of John Wesley, the role of lay preachers, the role of women, the travelling preacher on his horse there through the snow, how Methodists became interested in reading, all the way through to people who left our chapel to become missionaries, and one in China. So that gives a sort of flavour of what was happening in many of the early chapels of the time. So we wanted to tell those stories. Now we come to some of the pictures of our particular tapestry panels. And one or two, I'll show you the whole panel, but I wanted to show you some of the detail that we've got in the panel. So this is from Wesley's first visit to Newcastle, which is the start of our story at High House Chapel. And you can see some of the intricate stitch work that's gone into this one. There's Wesley standing on the sand hill down by the river with the boat behind and Gateshead in the background. And the picture actually comes from an etching from, I think, the 1800s. Quite different, the way the embroiderer for this one has worked. She's filled in the whole background to the picture, whereas some do a little bit and leave some of the background unstitched. You can see the different stitches she's used to show woodland and heather in the foreground, and then there's the texture of the coat. And that's John Wesley, who's visiting Weardale in 1772. And here we've got something about the role of women. Whoops. And this is an early Sunday school, 1770, so just before Rake's Sunday schools. Methodists were, you know, developing that role, and Wesley was quite supportive of the work of Rake's in the establishment of Sunday schools. But this one's got a lot of applique on it, so a completely different style. Look at the detail on the little slate the boy's got in his hand, and the book there. And apparently the work on the faces is called stump work. Don't ask me any more about that. And then a different style entirely by another embroiderer. And a play on words, oh, for 1,000 tongues to sing. In 1851, with the religious census, everybody had to say how many they had at the services on that particular day in March. And at High House Chapel, there were 1,050 people worshipping, over 3 different services during the day. But still, the chapel was full to capacity. And there we've got the idea of how the embroiderer wanted to do a full chapel, unable to stitch the details of every single person who was there. They're done in outline. But look at the Bible. What a beautiful piece of work that is. We wanted the schools to be involved, and we've got 4 or 5 primary schools in our area. We invited them to take part, and 4 of the schools said they would like to take part. COVID had just started, and Liz, our coordinator, she would be compromised by COVID, so she did Zoom talks with the schools, and she told them stories about Methodism in our area, and they went away with their own ideas, and they came up with their own pictures and their own versions of the story they wanted to tell. And they sent their drawings to me. I enlarged their drawings and drew them onto the fabric, and then sent them down to Tracy. And Tracy put them onto embroidery frames and returned to the schools and did a session with the school children on how they could do their embroidery. And they got on with that. And within a couple of terms, their embroideries were finished. We'd already told the Wesleyan story at High House Chapel, but 2 of the stories that the children told were from the primitive Methodist tradition, which was also in Weardale, of course. And shock horror, we've got Jane Ansdale from the Hull Circuit, who introduced Methodism to Weardale. Wow, a woman preacher in the area. And then we've got little Johnny Oxterby. He was from North Yorkshire, and he came as an evangelist from the Hull Circuit again into the area. And at one of his cottage meetings, there was nowhere to put his Bible, so somebody came forward from the congregation, from the people who was listening to him, and leaned over so that Johnny Oxterby could put his Bible on the lead miner's back in order to do his service. And there's Johnny Oxterby with a lovely rugby shirt, and the miner with his polka dot shirt, and the pickaxe showing that he is actually a miner. Other pictures from the schools. There was one about love feasts and love in cups. A lovely one which told the story that Methodists actually had to go to church and attend church services as well as their own Methodist services. And another one with John Wesley meeting up with the lead miner. But they're delightful, and when we take them out, people really enjoy looking at the enchantment of those children's works. But we wanted to tell many more stories than those 20. We wanted to go into the whole Methodist story. And how did we choose those? Well, I knew lots of stories, so there were lots that I was going to introduce. But I also wanted people to contribute their own stories to this. I'm not a Methodist historian. I didn't want it to be the history of Methodism. I wanted the stories to be little depictions of Methodist stories, the sort of things that you would get in Reader's Digest, just tiny snippets of stories. And I say I wanted some of the people who were paying attention to the project we were doing to come up with their own stories as well. So we've got stories about people, and some of them are about events, and some of them are about places, and some of them combine all of those things in one story. And we've got some of the social issues to do with Methodism, and of course music and mission. And then we've got things that don't really fit into any of those things as well. So we've got ones like the nicknames that were given to Methodists. And unfortunately, I don't have ranters on there, but these are the nicknames that were given to John Wesley and his little group of Methodists at the Holy Club in Oxford at the time. And we've got little stories about Wesley and his electric machine, his meeting with Bo Nash, which doesn't feature hugely in the history of Methodism, but it was a nice little story that I found about how he put down Bo Nash in Bath when he visited him. So we wanted to tell lots and lots of stories, and to make our number up to 100 if we could get there. And let me show you some of them. We have stories about people. I didn't want our collection to be just a lot of portraits, but we do have one or two portraits. We're going to have portraits of John and Charles and Mother Susanna. Mother Susanna we have finished. And this is a popular picture of Susanna, which we see in books. Look at the intricate work that she's got on her hat. Now, depicting the primitive Methodist leaders in a different way, I hope you recognise some of the centenary plate in that one. So there we've got Bourne and Clowes. And the way that embroiderers have decided to do their work is quite different in each one. Down the right-hand side, you can see some of the embroideries that are not shown today, but you know, it gives you an idea of the range of some of the people that we include in our collection. The one on the left, you've probably not heard of Thomas Harker. He's not one of the great out of the Methodist story, but he's perhaps more typical than most. He's a sinner turned repentant. And this tells a story that many Methodists told of how they became Methodist through giving up their sinful ways in order to follow Christ. So Thomas Harker here, he was a frequenter of pubs. He was a drinker. He was a gambler. He played dominoes. He played the hornpipe in the pub to entertain people. But when he saw the light, he wanted to give all of that up. And he was going to throw his dominoes and his violin into the fire. But he was persuaded not to. He was persuaded instead to take his violin down to the chapel and play hymns. And our little story tells that one. And we have other stories of people you may not have heard of. John Jones Taliesin, someone from Wales, and that story comes from a lady who did an earlier embroidery for us, and she wanted to do the story of her great grandfather, John Jones Taliesin from Wales. We've got stories about events. Young Jack Wesley being rescued from the Epworth rectory when he was just a boy. That's just a tiny part of Pearlie Parker's painting. Pearlie Parker was a painter, and while he was at Newcastle, in the year of the centenary of John Wesley, the founding of Methodism in 1739. So in 1839, Pearlie Parker did a painting for the conference in Liverpool. And this is just a little bit of it. We couldn't actually draw the whole picture. And next to it, another embroidery, quite different. And this one shows the Simmons being tossed on the Atlantic when John Wesley had his encounter with the the Moravians, and his faith was sorely tested. And this one will be familiar to all primitive Methodists. Kathleen had a photograph of Maucop, and she wanted to do that picture. And she needed no more from me than an outline, and she filled in all of the rest herself. An incredible detail that she's got on those castle walls, down to the vegetation and the rocks. But we also have other events. There on the left, the Tall Puddle Martyrs, Bishops to America, where we've got Cork and Asbury in our picture. Wesley's Whitfield's outdoor preaching. And the world is my parish, when Wesley talks to the Bishop of Bristol about his right to preach anywhere. Here's another primitive one. Ruth, I think it's Ruth. Ruth wanted to do a picture about Boylstone. She was somebody who was following our project and comes from the Boylstone area. And she said it's a really important chapel, just a tiny chapel, but it's reckoned to be the very first primitive Methodist chapel. I think there's a little bit of dispute about whether it was or it wasn't, but that doesn't matter. We like a bit of controversy in our works. And she wanted to do the picture of Boylstone. And we have done the early Sunday school as well. So Boylstone was 1811, the chapel, and I think the Sunday school was 1815, so they're early. She wanted to show that it was in the countryside, and all of the work through the window is her own work, even with the black sheep looking in. And she's put lovely little details like the patches on the knees, or the bare knee showing through, the toe poking out of the sock. Things that visitors will look at with interest. And then there's Jenny, who worked at the Luton Industrial College and wanted to write about that. She wanted a story about the Centre for Industrial Mission. And her picture is of the stained glass window there. And I didn't want the collection to be full of pictures of chapels either. But certain chapels, if it had a story attached to it, we would include. And this is the story of an octagonal chapel. I think there were about 10 or 12 octagonal chapels altogether, Heptonstall being one of them. So we've included Heptonstall in our collection. And we've also included Mount Zion. Thomas and Matthew from Mount Zion came up to see us when we had our first exhibition and pleaded with us to put their chapel into our collection. And we said, well, is there anything else about the chapel that we can latch onto? And they're a New Connection chapel. And so we could tell the story about the New Connection and how their Wesleyan minister was expelled and the New Connection man moved in. But that particular tapestry isn't finished yet, so we don't have it to show. Social issues. The biggest question I was always given when I was talking about Methodism in High House to groups who weren't Methodists was, what about Methodists and alcohol? And we got lovely stories to tell about Methodists and alcohol from that. And here, this is a depiction from Hogarth's picture of Gin Lane, where the ill man in the wheelbarrow is being doused with a drink, as is the baby who's being given a drink, probably to put it to sleep, and the two young ladies there who are indulging. Sybil Phoenix is featured in our collection, bringing you much more up to date. I think Sybil Phoenix is from the 1970s or 80s. Her campaign for racial justice, and there we've got the joining of hands of the different races. Prison visiting and reform, something which Wesley did from his very earliest days at Oxford University as one of the social issues, and how he went on to help with prison reform. And I later learned a little bit about court missionaries and the probation service from one of your earlier talks, and we've included that now as one of our stories which is going to feature in the collection. We've also got the suffragette movement, and we've chosen an American story for that one, and we've got an American embroiderer to do that, so that's one which is being done over in the States. And there's Wesley and slavery, and the last letter of his life to Wilberforce. We thought we'd get more stories about mission. In actual fact, we've got 3 stories about mission from China. We have our very own mission story about Joseph Race, who went to China as a missionary and ended up dispensing medicine from his medicine chest, and he became a medical missionary. And then we've got one from Leslie Griffiths from Haiti. I say, we thought we'd probably have more mission stories, but most of them came from China. Methodism and music. Charles Wesley's hymns do not lend themselves to doing a picture. They're not easy to illustrate. We do have over 1,000 tongues, which I've already shown you, and we've got Hark the Herald Angels Sing from his carols. But we have included other aspects of the music tradition. And a lady in Halifax who was following our story wanted to do While Shepherds Watch Their Flocks by Night to the tune of On Ilkley Moor Bar Tat. And I worked with her in order to create a story which merged those two things of the shepherd tending his flocks and the story of the two lovers on Ilkley Moor. And then we've got another interesting story about the Brunswick organ. Now, was that a story about an organ or a story about church politics? We tell that in our 150 words. Oh, and the last one I should mention, Fanny Crosby. This is one which we haven't started yet, but Fanny Crosby was an American Methodist evangelist, and she was blind almost from birth and wrote, I think, almost 1,000 hymns. And we are doing a tactile piece to honour Fanny Crosby's work. So one that isn't going to be behind glass, it's going to be one that people can touch. Coming towards the end now, we've got stories which don't fit. The Settle Methodist Chapel wanted to do one to show how their chapel had evolved over the ages and how now they're working to become an eco church, and they've got their gold award in 2023. So it shows John Wesley coming, their first chapel, their second chapel, their third chapel. This one was done by, whoops. This one was done by Scott from California. I met Scott at Tracy's, one of Tracy's working days in Durham, and he asked if he could do one. And he's done one for us on the different symbols of Methodism from around the world. Ones that I hadn't come across. I knew nothing about the scallop until I started doing this work. And we've got the Methodist Heritage logo. And others which don't quite fit the pattern. There's Primitive Physique. And we've seen the Methodist nicknames one. Recently, I found one about Aston Villa and Everton football clubs, which started off as Methodist teams. And we've got the Methodist Modern Art Collection. We haven't actually drawn one from the collection. We've made up a Methodist modern art piece for ourselves, but we feature the story of the Methodist Modern Art Collection in it. So, where can they be seen? Well, at the moment, I can see them all from where I'm sitting. They're in my conservatory because our chapel is not renovated yet, so we have no home for them. We take them out. Here we can see them being shown at Roker Chapel in Sunderland. We took them there last year and it was so popular they've asked us back for their anniversary this year. And we're going to Hexham next month. So we take them out for exhibition locally. We took them down to Halifax for their anniversary to Mount Zion, but that was a 13-hour day. So it's a long day. We decided not to go that far in the future. So we do exhibitions locally, regionally, and I do take a few of them out when I give talks around the area. Similar talks to the ones I'm doing today, but I take half a dozen of the tapestries out with me. But that's where they intended to go. A home at High House Chapel for 100 beautifully embroidered Methodist tapestries about the people called Methodists, along with lots of memorabilia that we've got that will go along with it. And if you want to see more of these wonderful works, I suggest that you go to our Facebook page, which is called Methodist Tapestries Collection, where you can see progress on the works as they're going on. And you can see hundreds of pictures of the tapestries, some of them completed, some of them still in work. And Liz describes the embroidery to you.